Welcome everybody to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And Fabienne, it's great to have you here today. Please, why don't you, to start off, introduce yourself and the fantastic work that you do?
Yes, wonderful. So it's a delight to be here with you again, Alan. I always love our conversation, so I'm looking forward to this one. And so I'm Fabienne. I live near Bristol in the UK, originally from France, but I've been in the UK for over 25 years. And my role is, well, I've got several hats. I'm a mum of two teenagers, but I'm also a teacher, so I work part-time. I'm a language teacher, and I've been teaching in different settings. I've taught languages across all settings, so from nursery all the way to higher education, adult education. And I call myself both a reformed mum and teacher because I feel that the last 3 years in particular, my outlook and my mindset has completely drastically changed because of the podcast conversations that I have. So I'm also a podcaster, and I'm also an author and a researcher. So I research what makes young people and adults in education flourish or not. So I look at why it is that in education the majority of people are not flourishing.
Yeah, and it's much needed.
Yes, well, it's interesting because now, obviously, the reason I call myself a reform teacher and a reform mum is because I never used to think this way. I used to think that we would embed well-being in the curriculum, but I never saw it as flourishing comes first and then the rest follows. And now I truly, really believe that wholeheartedly, in the sense that I do think that if we first get to know ourselves and we know who we are in this garden called life, so what Dr. Byrne Nichols calls inner standing. I really love that word. As a linguist, I love words, but I think this one works really well in if I first know who I am in this garden called life and what my needs are and how I contribute to the diversity of this garden, then it means that it's much easier because I can then be of service to others without feeling like I've got to protect myself. And so yeah, and my research is actually taking me towards community well-being. So I've been looking at individual well-being, the I, and I've been looking partly at at a national level, the us, sort of nations, for example, measure well-being. The UK sadly uses GDP as a measure. But you've got Bhutan that uses the growth happiness index as a difference, but there isn't a real index for community well-being. And this is what I'm looking at in terms of taking my research, exploring that you can measure the I, the well-being of the I, the well-being of the us, but you can't really measure the well-being of we with a measure that's been validated and done in an academic, ethically sort of rigorous way. And that's what I'm aiming to do next with the research.
Wow, that's very exciting, isn't it? And so as a linguist then, we're going to choose a word.
Yeah.
So first off, can I invite you to tell me how many times you'd like me to cut the deck?
7.
7, okay. I don't think anybody's asked me to cut it that many times before.
Always a first, right?
Yeah, exactly. So now I don't know if I've cut it 7. I've got 7 piles in front of me anyway. So would you like pile 1 or to 7?
Can I have pile 3, please?
Yes, you can. And then a card number between 1 and 4.
Oh, 4.
Okay.
Oh, interesting. I hesitated between that and 1, so it's interesting.
I thought you were going to say 1.
Well, yeah, both. I hesitate, but I said four, so that's
Which
fine.
would you prefer?
Either, I mean, courage speaks a lot to let's go with courage, actually, number one.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.
Right. So, and isn't this weird how that word came up? Because this is the word I think of when I think of you, and partly because of the association with the French root and we had that conversation, but partly because of the courage you've displayed in the time that we've known each other, in the decisions that you've made. So, right, okay, let's see where we go then. So to start,
it's interesting because both words are playing an important role in my life right now. So there you go.
And just as an aside, I did one recently, a ValuesJam with a lady who runs a kind of, it's play at work. So it's all about creativity and all of this sort of thing. And the evening before the ValuesJam, I don't know why, but I was thinking, wouldn't it be really weird if because there's a Joker card in the ValuesJam deck for, if you want to play with a word that isn't in the deck. And that's what came up. And
oh, wow, how funny.
Anyway, to courage. What does courage mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Okay. So, courage means, for me, it's very closely linked to a word, another word, authenticity. So, and it links to what I was saying about knowing, understanding, knowing who we are in this garden called life. So, courage means like boldness too, in a sense of, well, this is who I am, and I'm gonna show up unapologetically for who I am in this garden called life. And courage sometimes requires us to be bold and to be vulnerable. And you said, like the link to the French words. So courage for me is very much linked to the heart. So in French, heart, cœur, which, it comes from here. It's like that courage is like that little voice, the quiet little voice of your heart that really encourages you to show up and, authentically. Yeah, and that, I think that requires both boldness but also vulnerability for sure. It's, at times it has felt a little bit hard, that courage. But
Yeah, and you mentioned courage, and the phrase "to have the courage of your convictions," I think is the phrase that just popped into my mind, because when you have some sense of self, it's easier to display that courage because you have the confidence in what you are to be able to make those choices and to kind of feel that whatever the consequences are, you're going to deal with them, but it's the right thing for you to do. And then you also use the word encourage. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because when people use the word encourage, I don't automatically think of people being courageous, but actually that's what it is. When you're encouraging somebody, you're kind of making them all in, which is the same thing, right?
Yeah, and in French, encourage means like within the courage, within,
Yeah.
So yes, of course. Yeah. And with what you said, the showing up, I've not always been like this. That's why I call myself a reformed mum and teacher, is because before I think I sort of knew who I was, but I wasn't showing up authentically. I wasn't, I didn't have the courage to show up and to share. And as a result, what was happening is actually linked to that word respect, that the other one that we wanted to look at. It's sort of, I think there's a difference between wanting respect, or or looking for other people's respect, and actually when you display courage, you don't care whether people respect your views or not, because you're secure in where you are and who you are and what you stand for. And I think this is where you saying like the courage of one's convictions and beliefs. I feel, particularly beginning of this year, this is probably what has shifted the most, is as I get more and more settled and like feel secured in who I am as an individual and what I stand for, I can show up as myself, but I don't need people to validate that or to agree with what I'm saying, and therefore I'm trying far less to convince people. I just happily share, but I don't need people to follow if that doesn't resonate, which is not what was like before, previously. Yeah, so that's an interesting insight.
Yeah, and you've reminded me of a story, and it's parallel with what you've just described, and it was kind of a watershed moment for me, because I was talking to a company about a cultural transformation project that they wanted to do, and there was a procurement person in the room, and one other from the company. So I described the program that I was proposing, and the procurement guy said, so what difference is this going to make? So I answered saying that normally when I've done projects like this elsewhere, what happens is that customer satisfaction increases, employee engagement increases, and employee retention increases. And then I said, but it varies from organization to organization. And so I can't put my hand on my heart, there you go, Kur again, and tell you it's going to be a specific number. And he then said, well, if you can't tell me a specific number, we're not going to be able to award you the project. And before my brain could process what I heard my voice say, well, if you're not ready yet, let's not do it. And yeah, and then the guy, figuratively, his jaw hit the desk, he was just like totally flummoxed. And I didn't get the work. And on the way out, one voice was going, yeah, did you see his face? But the other voice was saying, you stupid fool, you've just lost a piece of work. But the reason I mention it to your point, is that that was a defining moment where I decided that I really didn't have the energy to be pushing water up a hill. And instead, I just wanted to be with people that, felt the same way and liked the same sort of stuff. So yeah, and I haven't thought of that for a couple of years, maybe.
Yes.
What about the metaphor, Fabienne? What does courage look, sound, and feel like?
So it's funny you ask, because the image that came when I saw the word courage is like Richard Lion King, like the lion, the roar, like that's what it, for me, that's what it feels like. But the metaphor is very often, or the process for me has been very much, like this image sometimes you see of a cat that looks in the mirror and it sees a lion.
Yeah.
Okay, so the process for me has been very much that. It's the feeling like, who am I to be talking about these things? very often. That's been the process to, well, who am I not to speak about those things, and that shift. And so yeah, I think the metaphor is definitely the roar of a lion, you know, yes, because I think, and that's what I like about that metaphor, is that I think lions can be, you know, they when they're really secure in their in their environment, they, you know, you feel that power, and actually there's that I'm not gonna go and mess around with you either, like, feeling, which yeah, I think is, yeah, I quite like that.
That's really interesting, because I just listening to you there, when you said about the lion's roar, I was thinking, oh, that's quite different to me then, because I don't actually think of courage like that. And actually, so this is my eldest daughter, quite some time ago, went on some sort of course. I don't even know what it was, but the guy delivering the course explained the principle of the dinosaur's tail. And what this is, and I think he was describing it in the context of when you're going into, for instance, an interview situation or something like that. So the principle is that you just think of all of the successes that you've had and all of the things that people that you love say about you, and that is the equivalent of your dinosaur tail. And what he described was that when you think of all of those things, it's like this long tail behind you, which means that you're really stable and nobody's going to push you over, kind of thing. And that stuck with me, actually. And so the reason that I think differently to you is that I think for me, courage is actually quite quiet. And it's just this sense of like a big heart inside, but this really not silent, but almost actually confidence that what you're going to do is what you're going to do, and that's it. So it's really, I love that contrast, actually.
Well, I wonder, and that's just me, you know, like putting my two pennies worth in it, but it's like perhaps the journey between the male and the female, as in, I feel throughout my life, I've had to stand my ground as a woman.
Yeah.
And to, you know, I recently said how I've only just recently realized, but when I worked in academia, when I worked in the university, I used to say to people, I only have 2 MAs. Like really? Until somebody, so another woman sort of looked up, challenged me and went, only? Like, you only have 2 MAs, Fabienne? And then I was like, oh. So I wonder whether, and this is just obviously, I don't know, my thinking, but perhaps that women have to be, to maybe through like expressing courage, you have to slightly be a bit pushier and maybe a bit more like that lion and that roar, because we are encouraged to maybe be less vocal. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just my experience, but that's what perhaps
there might well be something in that. When when you put MA after your name, if you've got 2 of them, what do you do?
I don't put MA after my name.
But this is a bad joke coming here, right? But I was thinking, you know, you're Fabienne Vailes, MA, and somebody saying to you, why do you have to tell people you're a mama?
Well, there you go. Like that. Yeah.
No, actually, I have 2 MAs.
Maybe that's what I need to put behind. I like that. Yeah, and that's so relevant, because I definitely feel more like a mama these days than I did when I was a young mum with younger children. definitely.
Yeah. So let's get into courage a bit more now then. So where have you noticed a lack of courage?
What, in myself or others or
Anywhere.
society or anywhere? Actually, I feel in our society generally, I think in the UK currently there's a lack of courage. And I'll tell you why. This is something I was discussing recently with my husband. We seem to be accepting an awful lot of behavior that I believe is actually unacceptable behavior. And this is hidden under and I understand why. Okay, when we're in, because I research, I'm not condoning, the behavior. I think for me, is when we're in survival, the courage bit is much more difficult than when you feel you're flourishing. So that I'll preface what I'm about to say with that, right? I understand it's not a critic, it's not a judgment, it's just a noticing the. It's so easy these days to just say, oh, but it is what it is. Oh, well, it is what it is. Well, if we just accepted that it is what it is, then, women wouldn't have a right to vote, because they've just, suffragettes would have just accepted, oh, it is what it is. You women don't have a right to vote. Or, Black people would still be sitting, segregated, in different areas, because it is what it is. And so, as a linguist, again, I feel that so often I feel like challenging those words, that it is what it is. What? So that's it? We just accept it? Things like there's laws, but only some of us apply and you respect those laws. I pay my taxes. And so why aren't people willing to pay their taxes? Like, why is there, and why is it okay that some don't and others? If there's a law, then everybody is there anybody above the law? In which case we say openly, some will pay the taxes and others are above the law and don't pay the taxes, right? And I do think that, therefore, that fear leads to this lack of courage, that when we're fearful and in survival, we also feel powerless and linked to feeling like hopeless and and then therefore you just sort of go, oh, well, who am I and what can I do to change things? So it's the same with suddenly all the prices of electricity and gas have completely increased. We've made it a really, a rare sort of resource. The minute you make something scarce, then you make it more, important, right? And again, we've just accepted that. But you look at those big companies and they're making billions in profits. So explain that one to me, because I don't quite understand. I'd like somebody to explain in a very rational way why that is or how that works. And yeah, so I think, I guess part of my frustration is this thing of, well, we can't just simply accept, and sometimes you have to have the courage to say, it's like, when I was younger, I was in a relationship with someone who wasn't really kind to me, but, I realized he treated me the way I treated myself. Like, he couldn't love me, he could only love me to the extent that I loved myself. And that wasn't very much. So obviously, the result, until the point where I just said, no more. I'm not going to tolerate this, and you're not going to talk to me this way, and I'm out. And then his behavior completely changed. So I think sometimes it's interesting, like going back to the word courage, that sometimes we feel we're powerless, but, maybe we're not so powerless. And that when you suddenly, say no, or you have clear boundaries, or you have, then it goes back to that sort of standing, being in the garden called life and knowing who you are. It also means that you know what goes and what doesn't, and like what you will tolerate and not tolerate, what you will accept, and so therefore there's clearer boundaries, and that's also what it feels like to me.
And there's a number of things in my head at the moment, actually. So on what's happening in the UK and decisions and stuff, and I know you've not been totally explicit, but you've kind of referred to a couple of things, and it seems to me that, and this is linked to courage, but not in the sense of being brave, more in the sense of it being something that you strongly believe in, that's important to you. And it feels like nothing is important to some people, and they just want kind of the easy way out, or what's convenient, or not standing up for anything, actually. And so this, I presume you're talking about the politician that has just settled a tax bill.
Well, he was our chancellor and therefore in charge of taxes. There's a slight ethical issue right here. Well, as a researcher, I have to declare my conflict of interests.
Yeah, and I mean, you use the word slight probably a little in jest, but it's kind of, if integrity and accountability is so important to you, if it's important enough to you, so these are the two of the three words that our Prime Minister used in order to become the Prime Minister.
Yes, professionalism, integrity, and accountability. Yeah. And none of those, it goes back to some of the conversations we've had before around, are those values laminated? Is it easy? Are you giving it this?
Yeah.
And linked to courage, to me, that, values are not cheap. Values require that if you believe strongly in something, sometimes you will have to stand up for that. And sometimes, it's not always easy. Yeah. That this is where the courage is, like, to me, that's where it's linked to your heart. If it really truly matters, then sometimes you will have to. And I do feel that over the last 2 years in particular, I've had to make decisions where I've had to go upstream when everybody else is going downstream. And for the people who, if anybody is listening to this, just as an example, I talk about flourishing and looking at what makes young people and teachers and educators and parents flourish or not. And then when my son went back to school my eldest went back to school after COVID, he kept saying that he didn't want to go back because he wasn't enjoying it, and he really enjoyed being at home learning by himself. And I'll be honest, I was fobbing him off, because it's great to listen to innovators and disruptors from a distance and go, this is awesome what you're doing, right? It's wonderful to look at disruptors and go, yeah, okay, but not really for me. And then when he said, I want to be home educated, I was like, yeah, we'll look at it. And then we sort of talked to people who were home educated, and it's like, do you think it would be possible? And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe. And then then during the holiday over Christmas last year, he said, you talk about people who flourish, don't flourish, but what happens when it's your son? And I didn't know what to say. I honestly didn't know what to say. Yeah. What happens when the rubber hits the road, right? And then it's like, and I had to have courage, because, you know, I had to, you know, I'm from the system, and, you know, it was like breaking up. It was like a real breakup of a relationship with an education system that I believe in mainstream free education for everybody. Of course, that's why I went into education. And so it was a real process for me, but that required the courage to, you know, I had to look at myself in the mirror and go, okay, am I going to continue giving it this and talking about flourishing and why it matters, but not allow my son to,
Yeah.
you know, that is it. And, you know, going back to what we were talking about, our politicians or, you know, people, it's easy to say things, words, you know, it's quite cheap to sort of say things. And the courage sometimes is, that's where it requires for me, it was a real like, raw, okay, in that sense, because it required to change so many of my beliefs and to let go of so many things.
And then
That's tough.
there's also something about the knock-on impact, and I have no evidence whatsoever of this, but I just happened to read a post on a neighborhood community app recently, and it was basically a bunch of young kids causing problems in a fast food outlet. And I think they stole a phone and a bike, or, you know, stuff like this. And then the police don't respond. And I was thinking about, well, I wonder if there's any connection between young people making choices to behave like that and the most senior leaders we have in the country making choices to ignore the law. And if, you know, I feel intuitively that it absolutely is a connection, because our behavior is influenced by, when I say role models, I don't necessarily mean people that we choose to follow, but people in important positions are in a position of influence. And if they behave or are perceived to behave badly, then it just seems logical to me that people are going to think, so if that's okay for them, it's going to be okay for me.
Yeah, sure.
And if only those senior people could understand, you know, if that is a direct relationship. Imagine you saying to somebody like the senior politician that we're talking about, do you realize that your personal behavior is going to lead to millions of people trying it on to larger degrees or lesser degrees?
Yeah.
Overall impact is going to be this.
Yeah.
It feels like then they would be, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was going to be the impact, and so yes, of course I would behave differently. But it just seems that and actually this goes back to what you were talking about right at the beginning, where you were talking about the I and the us and the we. It seems that society is geared towards the I, and there's no reward or recognition for focusing on the us and the we.
No. Well, I think for me, so the analogy I like to use is, at the moment, and I do think that from the way the education system is geared up, is we are being taught that, and we are teaching our young people that it's a dog-eat-dog world, that you have to compete, that it's we have to be individualistic, that we have to focus on what's in it for me. And to be honest, when Dominique and I wrote How to Grow a Grown Up, this is what we heard from the young people. That's what they feel, and they say. And, you know, if as a parent or, you know, an educator, you don't believe me, turn on your TV and you'll see how many competitions there are. You can't ice skate, you can't bake, you can't dance, you can't, you know, find love without it being a competition. And that is so insidious, it's so deep in the iceberg that nobody notices. But the message is, compare yourself to others, comparatitis. And that leads to that perfectionism and that fear of failure and the imposter syndrome. And to some degree, all of us, because we've been conditioned under those, because it's really changed. So being French, having been raised in France up until the sort of late 90s, I arrived in the UK in 97. Again, this is something that I've only just, because I'm thinking about community well-being, realizing. I've always found in the UK a difference, and I couldn't quite pinpoint what that was, but I think Britain is much more individualistic than in France. So there's a bit more collectivism in France, although that's changing. But I remember growing up in France, local markets, so you would go and see your butcher and the veg people every week, and you have a relationship. I remember my mum's tire blowing on the motorway. It was 9. 2 lorry drivers stopped, one in front of the car, one on the other one, and literally those 2 men sorted out the tires and made sure we were safe. Today, if that happens to you, well, good luck. Or if a lorry driver stops, you probably as a woman would be really concerned. And that is weird, right? Because we don't trust each other. There's this real thing where we've dismantled this connection with the humanness. And I think it's that connection back to the heart. So for me, I think what's happening, and I was doing it not so long ago. So again, this is a very much hands up. This is new to me, but because we are encouraged to use this, like our heads, it used to go for me straight to head to muscles, bypassing the heart. And now actually it's okay, head percolate through the heart, then into the muscles, and back up. And I think that's a very different proposition, because it's less reactive, it's slower, and then it's a much more considered response.
What about you? When you were talking about how everything is so competitive, and I agree with that. However, at the same time, I'm kind of concerned about the opposite end, where it's just like everybody plays a part. There's no recognition of those people that do really well and all of that sort of thing. And you've reminded me of a story. It was from Scotland, and in this particular, I think it must have been a county or a region of schools, it was agreed that if it gave a specific example of a football match where one team was winning 10-0 at halftime. And as a result of that, a decision was made that if that ever happened, the second half would start at 0-0.
Why?
Because they didn't want these kids to finish the game feeling so devastated that they had lost a football match, right? So it's how do we have the courage to not feel that it has to be one extreme or the other, and to find a way to instill a competitive mindset, but not one that is absolute.
Yeah. And I think for me that I don't have an issue with competitiveness if competitiveness, and in fact I wouldn't call it competitiveness as a linguist. I would call that more rivalry.
Yeah.
So because what happens is competitiveness is you compare yourself to others, whereas rivalry is literally comparing, okay, so you are, there's somebody else trying to do something, but then you bring it back to yourself, and then you go, okay, how do I learn from this situation, and how do I grow and develop? And that's a very different proposition, because it goes back to that inner standing I was talking about, which means that you also recognize that some of us are naturally better at doing things. Some of us have like that innate or that natural talents, others less so. But it goes back to, for me, I think it's a question of, are you trying to win because then you feel it's going to define you better as an individual, which I think is all fear-based. So I don't have an issue with, to be honest, I think trying to protect our kids from the challenges of life, whatever they are, like losing a game, well, you can do that all you want, bubble wrap them if you want, but you know what, life will teach them anyway, because that's how this construct is made. This is how life on this physical plane on Earth works. And in fact, it's through adversity that we grow. It's not when everything is hunky-dory. Yeah. So, when I say this over competitiveness, I don't have an issue with, like people then automatically assume, or we might think that I have an issue with, we need to prevent our children from experiencing those things. Absolutely not, because that's part of the growth and the development, and it'll happen anyway, one way or another. And in fact, very often what happens is I find that the parents who overprotect their kids the most, it's a little bit like, it's the analogy of, you would never ever take your child and lock them in a room until they're 18 to protect them from not catching a cold or being ill. Yeah, granted, as a parent, it's not really pleasant when you see your child really struggle with an illness, but you understand deep down that is them developing their immunity so that they can then, cope with the cold, cuts, whatever. That's how your immune system works. The same is true of emotional health and everything else. If you bubble wrap your child, remove all the obstacles when they're teenagers, and then you open the door and you go to uni as far as possible from me as possible, and then you wonder why they're not coping. It's like closing them in the door in a completely germ-free room for 18 years, opening the door and then going, okay then, darling, then not going to stand very long before being really, really poorly. And so, yeah, I think that's really important as a discussion.
I'm not sure that it builds courage, but it builds resilience when you have those sort of experiences. So imagine those children that never lose a football match, when they're really young, and then they experience adversity and they have no idea how to deal with it. But if you've experienced it in different settings, which ultimately are less important, in the context of your whole life, it really helps you deal with more important things when they occur. Mm. And I'll just share this with you because I've learned during Values Jams that you should just get out what crosses your mind, even though it might not be in exactly the right place. And this is going back to when you were talking about, you bringing your son out of school and homeschooling. And I was thinking of an example in business. So this guy became the guy running a prison. And he told me a story about one of his senior team that had just been awarded a large pay increase. And he was curious about this because he didn't understand why it had happened. And there was basically a process in place where there was a pay review board, and they had the authority to sign off on a pay review. And then it was just approved by the governor. So this guy in the new role. And he discovered that there was a personal relationship between the individual who received the pay award and a number of the people on the pay review committee, which meant that for whatever reason, that decision had been made. And so now I think this is an example of courage. He refused to approve it. So his signature was required to be able to put in process the payment. And he refused. And he was told, well, you don't have the authority to change it. And he said, well, I'm still not going to sign it. And
that is real courage, right? It's like really standing for what you believe in. Yeah.
That's the point, isn't it? It's like when you are putting yourself, when you're exposed yourself because of your beliefs, that's how you know how important they are to you. And oh goodness me, here's one from when I was about 12, and at school, this older kid started to fight, and he was much bigger than me and older, and so I ran away. And I ran around the corner and bumped into a teacher. And the teacher said, and it was a rule that you weren't allowed to run in that part of the school. And the teacher started saying to me, you know very well that you're not supposed to be running here. And started explaining that I had to write lines. That was one of the first punishments that you had. And I said to him, can I explain? And he said, well, yes, but it's not going to change anything. You were running and you will be punished for it. And I said, well, this older boy was picking on me, and the only thing I could do to get away was to run. And he said to me, do you really expect me to believe that? And I was so furious. I remember crying and being really embarrassed. But the reason that I was crying was that I was so furious inside that people weren't believing what I was saying. And I don't know, what's that about? I don't know why that's related to courage, actually. But oh yeah, so I was exposed. I was very vulnerable. I did put forward what I believed in, but it made absolutely no difference whatsoever. And I don't know why, but fairness / kindness is a personal value that I attach so much importance to, and that's an early experience, I think, that probably played an important part in developing that. Now, I'm conscious of time, and the time has flown, as it always does in these conversations. But to wrap it up, here's a question. What are you encouraged to do differently about courage as a result of our conversation?
So your last points about children not being heard really resonated with me, because that's also something that I feel really strongly about, like the courage to stand up for young people more and to give them a forum. And that's been a lot on my mind, on the, so I think, given what we've just discussed, what I'm encouraged to do, what I'm going to be doing more of, is to be even more courageous, and to be even but courageous in the sense that, well, I'll share with less and less of like need for the validation and the worry and the so I think that's probably what I'm going to take away from this, is being courageous, sharing from my heart, and that's it, and not worry about how it's going to be received.
Okay, and when might you have the first opportunity to do something like that, or something building towards it?
Well, I've had the opportunity to say that this morning with my family, and with the so actually sharing my truth without expecting the others to then change their behavior, but like being honest in terms of, I think that's what I mean. So so showing up in a this is my truth. I'm not expecting you to change your behavior. I'm just sharing what is true for me right now. and then reflecting on what I need to do therefore to feel, so without giving too much of the event or what happened, something happened that triggered a past fear for me of not being good enough and not being loved enough. And rather than just putting it back on the other person, sort of going, well, you don't love me enough or whatever, I actually walked away because I felt I needed space to process what was going on for me. And then once I'd done that and gone for my walk with my dog, which is my daily sort of connection to back to nature, I came back and then I was able to say in a very, sort of calm way, or this is what happened, this is what I felt. And, and I think this is where courage comes from for me. It's like the sharing what's on your heart, what matters. Yeah. And it includes sharing the fears and sharing behaving in a way. So the other thing I think I'm going to take away, and I've mentioned that in the another call we've had about specifically around education, but my big dream is to bring more heart into education. And so again, I think I'm going to show up more with my heart, authentically as me, and not go back to the reverting to being formal and, because that's what I can do. I can be me and yeah, I think that's what I'll do and I'll take away.
Good. So mine is, where to begin on this. Last week I was on, you were on the call as well, when Jenny shared how she was going to focus on being a better parent of adult children. And it got me thinking, because I think two parts to this. One, I didn't really know my dad beyond the age of about 12. And so I never experienced a father figure. So I feel as though maybe I don't really know how to do it very well. And then when I heard what Jenny said as well, I thought, that's interesting, because with our kids, I think my perspective was that my job was to get them from birth to being an adult, and that was the job done, right? But and having said that, I love what they are as adults, actually, and I'm enjoying them as adults kind of just as much as when they were kids. So I saw 3 of the 4 of them at the weekend because it was Sam's kind of birthday lunch celebration. And I gave Jack, my other son, a lift. And I thought, what I'm going to do in the car on the way, because it was about an hour journey, I'm going to ask him to be a great dad. What should I continue to do? What should I start to do? And what should I stop doing? And I chickened out, because we started a conversation and it went somewhere else and I couldn't find the right moment. So my takeaway from this is that I'm going to buckle down and ask those questions of the 4 of them and explain why.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think this is what about the intention, isn't it? I think for me, what I heard is, what's the intention driving the behavior? It's is the intention. And I think that's also a key takeaway from this conversation, is actually perhaps in the past that being courageous was partly to get a validation. And what happens if you don't seek validation, if you just share your truth and just ask and be curious and look at the growth, then does that look different? I don't know. That's an interesting.
Yeah, and when I was thinking about how to go about doing this, so like when I had heard what Jenny said, I thought, well, I could just guess, and I could just do some stuff that I think would make them think that I was doing a better job or whatever it is. Or actually I could ask them. And then I was thinking, I use those 3 questions when I'm working with individuals and with organizations. And the reason I like it is because it's so balanced. So what it's saying is, yes, there are some things that are done well at the moment. There are some things that really need to stop. And there are some things that aren't done that could be started. And then I'm not, I'm not going to I'm not going to take it too personally what the answers are. Right? What's more important is that they feel safe enough to be absolutely honest. And you use the word curious. I am really curious about not only what each of them will say, but I really enjoy how different they are, each of the four of them. And so that is going to make it easier in a way as well, because it's the difference that is understanding the difference that's part of the intention.
Yeah. Amazing. And yeah, fascinating. And one last takeaway I've just heard you sort of say that I'm taking away is that actually courage is also being okay, being you. And so when you get the feedback, it doesn't really mean you don't have to change as a human being, as in like you don't have to take it as or that feedback means I'm rubbish or whatever. There's a real like letting go as well and being of service to the other.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so really, thank you.
Well, thank you for having the courage to come on here and have a values jam. That was a great conversation, and I'm, like with you, it's going to be one of many conversations going forward. So thanks again, Fabienne.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye, Alan.